Today's afternoon art is going to be a demonstration of a simple winter watercolor scene. So for this you're going to want some watercolor paper, something a little bit thicker than regular copy paper. Some kind of watercolors, they may look like this. I have some I've put into a palette here that I like to use. You can use the middle for mixing, or you can use the lid of your tray for mixing. I've got two different size brushes, a bowl of water, and some paper towels handy. So to begin with, I'm going to use just clean water to kind of wash over my entire paper. So I'm just wetting my paper all over with clean water. You don't want to scrub too much because that might make your paper start to tear or deteriorate. So once I have it all damp evenly with water, you can kind of see there's a little bit of a sheen or a shine to it. That lets me know I got everything with the water. So next I am going to put just a little bit of warmth in the sky. You think of winter as cool, cold colors, but often the light in the sky has some kind of warm, that is a little bit too much. So what I'm going to do is take some more water, spread that around, and it will fade and spread a little into all that water I put on. And then I'm going to go ahead with more what you would normally think of as a winter sky. Some blue kind of washed over my sky. And again, I'm trying not to scrub too much, and I made kind of a horizon line here. And nice. Okay, then I'm going to let that dry for a few minutes, and I will put some trees in. So I'm going to let that dry until it's just not quite so shiny, maybe just the slightest bit of a sheen. Okay, so I let this dry just a little bit. It still feels kind of cold and damp to the touch, but it's only shiny in a few places on the edge, so I think that's what I'm going for. So I'm going to put some winter trees kind of along the edges here. So I'm going to let the watercolors do some of my mixing. Instead of mixing a dark green, I'm going to start by making some brown, and then I'm going to mix in some orange, like the orange from our sky. And I'm just kind of scribbling some little evergreen tree shapes. They get more narrow and the branches go upwards towards the top, and towards the bottom they're a little more flat or even pointed downwards. So while this is still wet, I'm going to come in with a greenish blue. And let's see what happens. Just little bits, and let it mix on your paper. So I'm touching the paper where the brown and orange is still wet, and I'm letting this greenish blue mix with it. and letting the watercolor do the mixing instead of mixing on my palette. Letting it mix on the paper. Okay, and I'm not using too much water on my brush. I'm using more paint than water. I want my paint to be pretty thick when I'm putting it on. This tree has a little too much paint, so I'm gonna dry my brush off, and it'll suck up. If it's a nice thirsty brush, it'll suck up some of that extra paint, so my trees have a little more light in them. And I think I'm going to put an extra tree here in the middle. Just making some little lines that when you add them all up, they look more like a tree. Okay, so now I'm going to let this dry even more before I do too much other work. So now I'm going to add one big tree here in the foreground. So things that are closer to you will be larger, and these trees that are small appear farther away. So I'm going to use the same colors pretty much as those trees. So I've got this nice orangish brown. So I'm taking some orange and taking some brown and mixing them on my palette. And this tree is going to be right here. I'm going to make a line with my brush to kind of tell me where that tree is going to live. So I'm going to start with some branches that point up. And I'm using mostly paint, not too much water. And my tree with this first layer of color is going to look kind of bald, like it doesn't have very many branches. Might put a little bit of yellow in that mixture too. Okay, so that tree doesn't look very healthy, but wait until we add some of our dark greenish blue. So making a nice puddle of a dark greenish blue here. And making sure I have a lot of paint on my brush. So I'm going to start and make some of my marks overlap with those orangish brown marks. But I'm letting that brownish orange peek through sometimes too. I keep getting more paint, not more water, more paint. Now I'm glad I made a big puddle because I'm almost out of that greenish blue I made. But if that happens, that's okay. You can just go ahead and mix some more together, and it's okay if it doesn't match your first batch for your first puddle, because trees are different colors, every branch a little bit different. Okay, and there's some spaces where my paint was not really thick enough or my paper was too wet, so I could try putting some more of this thick paint on there. I think my paper is very wet. So what I might do is wait for the paper to dry some more and then go back and add a few more details of paint over top of that. But I like that tree. I think it looks good. It looks like the light is shining through. Now my greens look almost the same everywhere, so I'm gonna take, I don't have my brush very wet, but I'm gonna take a tiny bit of straight blue and paint that on some places, like shadows. Makes it look more like a blue spruce tree. And some of this will mix on your paper with the other wet colors, and some of it your eye will do the mixing for you. Okay, so I think that looks pretty good. I like that tree. I'm going to leave him alone for a bit. So the last thing I want to do is some shadows from these trees. It seems like the light is coming from behind. So I'm going to mix up. First, let me clean my palette off a little bit, so I've got some good mixing area. So I just take a damp rag or a paper towel or a paper napkin and clean that off a bit. And now I can mix some color for my shadows. So I'm going to mix a little brown and a little blue to make kind of a gray color. And that's what I'll use for my shadows. Putting a little red in there. Okay, so I've got a brush full of this gray color, and I'm going to make shadows like the light is coming this way. And those are a little bit darker than I wanted, so I'm going to take some water and kind of push that color around a bit, like so. And I'm going to put, just with the little bit of gray that's still on my brush, maybe grab a tiny bit, I'm going to add a few more shadows in the snow here. So that snow is seeming very warm, so I'm going to take just a little blue and drop it into those shadows. That's a little stronger than what I want. So I'm going to dry my brush and lift some of that blue back up. Now when this is dry, I can take an old toothbrush or an old paintbrush if I want, and I could splatter some white paint. Now usually you don't have white watercolor, so you might look around and see if you have white tempera paint or white acrylic or white craft paint. That might work instead. You could also take a white oil pastel and dot some little snowflakes like that. I've let my painting dry a good bit. There's one or two spots that might be a tad bit wet, but I think it's dry enough. So I've got some white tempera paint I put here on my palette. I'm going to get my brush full of that paint, and I'm going to try some splattering to add some snow. Now you might take a piece of scrap paper first and practice doing a little bit of a flick with your brush like this, and then you'll see the little splatters that you get, so you have an idea how that's going to work before you do it on your finished painting, because you've worked hard on this painting now. And so here I'm going to flick. You might want to put some newspaper down or do this outside because it can get a little messy. And if your paints aren't washable, you want to protect your clothes, anything else nearby. And you can make as much snow falling in your painting as you want. It could be just a little dusting of snow or a whole blizzard. If you have an old toothbrush that you're not going to use to brush your teeth anymore, those are really great for splattering paint as well. In that case, you would hold it with the bristles down and use your thumb along the side to splatter the paint. You could also try doing some tiny dots, depending on your brush, with white paint on your brush. But I really like the way the splatters look. More random and more natural. It usually gives you smaller dots. Okay, I'm happy with that. So be sure to wash out all your brushes, and you can see I've made a mess with that splattering. So I'm going to take a damp paper towel or rag and clean that up right away before it dries, just to be safe. So I hope you have happy holidays, and I'll see you again here at BRAHM.